I'm so glad I watched this video. All of their beliefs are just so much more nuanced, and I gain a greater appreciation of them because of this video. The flesh is weak, and thus we must become anime. The first Adeptus Mechanicus Vtuber. Probably. Why hello there, it's me. After watching some of Bricky's videos on Warhammer 40k, I've decided to do a deeper dive into the Adeptus Mechanicus. After we finish playing Space Marine, I do plan to stream Mechanicus here on the YouTube channel, so I thought it would be useful to know more about them. So without further ado, let's get right to the video. Ah, yes. We got this when I started playing Space Marine, right? Just strong. Adeptus Mechanicus. The flesh is weak after all.
In the darkness of the 41st millennium, humanity's galaxy-spanning empire, the Imperium, wields its immense armies of the god Emperor of mankind to wage its unceasing internal and external wars. While individual worlds may have some flexibility in how they are controlled and governed, the word autonomy is not one to be thrown around lightly, for the Imperium is the all-powerful administration who oversee everything, and whatever they demand from a world, it must obey. Entire systems have spent thousands of years repaying debts in material or human cost by incurring some foolish miscalculation in terms of how much independence they believe themselves to have in challenging the Imperium. Whilst layers of privilege within the Imperium can bring groups, houses, families and individuals degrees of independence, it would be a stretch to call this freedom in any true sense, for the eyes and ears of the Imperium are embedded everywhere throughout human society.
If you go against the Imperium, that is heresy. You're basically betraying the order of the Emperor, and I mean any Inquisitor would probably just smite you immediately. But from what I picked up from the Bricky videos, is that the Adeptus Mechanicus, I've seen in the comments that they do actually worship the Emperor, but as like the messenger of their god, which is the machine god. I think it's called the Omnissiah or something like that. Essentially, you just kind of had to leave the Adeptus Mechanicus alone, simply because they're the ones who make all the cool shit, right? All the really big ass weapons that you'd be using to fight all these wars. And nobody else can really do it nowadays, since all of that knowledge has been lost ever since the AI wars, right? Which I don't really know too much about, I only just heard mention of that.
There are always those who wish to exploit the knowledge of those who are acting outside the lines. Even rogue traders and inquisitors are still ultimately beholden to some authority within the Imperium. There exists of course one major exception to the rule, the Adeptus Mechanicus of Mars.
There we go.
The red-robed, often cybernetically augmented individuals are seen on every Imperial ship, every Imperial world, every bastion, hive city and Imperial installation. One would be forgiven for thinking they are just another designation of Imperial workers, technicians, overseers.
Completely different.
But no, they're far more than this. The Mechanicus, unlike the rest of humanity, are not directly beholden to the Imperium. They hold many thousands of their own worlds which are governed entirely under their own control and independent from the Imperium. They have, through the power they were able to retain, been able to maintain the closest thing that resembles autonomy. And sometimes it's not immediately clear just how powerful the tech priests of the Mechanicus are, and this is likely for good reason and by design, because if there was more active resistance between the Imperium and Mechanicus, it could be extremely destructive. But to give one example of just how powerful the tech priests are, by imperial decree of the Emperor himself, any discovery of technology made belongs to the tech priests, be it data, archaeotech reclamation, or salvage, which has often led to the question, just what unknown technological discoveries have been made by the tech priests of the Mechanicus, but were never shared with the wider Imperium.
Another fact that I picked up from the comment section is that apparently there is old technology or knowledge of old technology that the Emperor knows of, but like nobody else within the Imperium knows of anymore, which is why the Mechanicus have kind of like struck up this deal with the Emperor so that he shares his knowledge of the old technology, whether through like he remembers it or like he can read a manual about it. But that's actually kind of funny. The Emperor like reading a manual on how to install an IKEA shelf or something like that. But for all the other current technology that we're using with all the like magical incantations where they're actually like, you know, fixing things, but it's also has to be religious, right? The Mechanicus deal with all of that.
Disturbing questions about the true power of what is effectively a rival to the Imperium itself, but who treat one another with due respect and diligence in a marriage of diplomatic and quasi-religious convenience.
Cult of knowledge and the weakness of flesh.
When people are newly initiated into the galaxy of war that spans the 10,000 years through to M41, one of the first things they will be of course introduced to is the galaxy-spanning empire of humanity, the Imperium. That collective umbrella designation of the Imperium is very obviously speaking extremely broadly, and perhaps necessarily so given the complexity of the hierarchy that sits under it. The Adeptus Terra, Inquisition, Ecclesiarchy, the Administratum, and the many specific designations of military branches. One thing that I find is often surprisingly glossed over, which now that I think of it I'm guilty of doing myself, is not showcasing the true power or importance of the Mechanicus. More formally, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Tech Priests of Mars, the Cult of the Machine, for the keepers of humanity's advanced knowledge, go by many names. They are the devoted servants of the Cult Mechanicus and exist in service to the Omnissiah, but this collective title of Tech Priest covers many thousands of different roles within the Mechanicus. Janitors, artisans, magos with their myriad subclassifications, trans and lex mechanics, engine seers, cognitors, myrmidons. All are integral components, cogs, if you will, in the vast machine of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Primarily, they are the keepers of knowledge. In an age where humanity has largely stagnated in all things, most especially in terms of scientific research and development, for the acquisition of any new understanding is seen as a quasi-religious affair. For while those of the Cult Mechanicus remain an adjacent element of the Imperium of Mankind, they worship the machine god, of which the Omnissiah, the Emperor, is merely its physical manifestation, more akin to an emissary corporeal vessel for communication with the machine god. The authority of the Adeptus Mechanicus in matters technological is unquestioned. As we noted, the Mechanicus are so intrinsically woven into all aspects of the Imperium, they are found at every level of operations. Even the Astartes send their own to Mars to learn the secrets of the cult and gain greater understanding of machines so that they can become tech marines. The Tech Priests and Cult Mechanicus differ significantly from the rest of humanity in how they see the galaxy and universe, both ideologically and in their forms of ritual worship. Their philosophical foundations are only partially aligned with the rest of humanity and its smothering imperial cult at a superficial level, with then most of the rest of what they believe being tolerated at best, frowned upon by most, and considered deeply heretical by those within the more formal and conservative departments of the Imperium, specifically
not that you can do anything about it.
One of the things that is most notable, of course, about the Mechanicus is their appearance, and their apparent lack of respect applied when it comes to the organic form, the flesh and bone of humanity. Yet they have good reason for this in both how they view human form and what they see as being the priority for all humanity, especially those members of the Mechanicus. While somewhat of a tangent, the way in which the Mechanicus view themselves and organic forms directly connects with the overall outlook and their entire philosophy, so it is helpful to understand. This apparent lack of feeling toward the human form is partially why servitors and so many bioaugments are forged and applied with an apparent disregard for the aesthetic or discomfort of the person. I've often heard it asked, why in the galaxy of 40k are the augmentations or cybernetic enhancements made with such a disregard for appearance, not more finished, more styled, and cleanly integrated with the human form? Basically, why are they so incredibly ugly? And it's true, especially when it comes to the Mechanicus, that their adaptations can be quite horrific, crude, blunt mergings of machine and flesh.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Because it's not like they have any respect for the human form to begin with saying like the flesh is weak. But also, I feel like there is an aspect of, I guess, survival from what I know, it's like they had to live underground for several years, several thousands. I would imagine that function comes over aesthetics for them. And in a horrible universe like 40k, I feel like function that will allow you to survive is much better than aesthetics that make you look good when you're dead.
Faces cut away, bare teeth exposed, bones, skulls. It often looks very much like the body has just been hacked away with little regard for preservation, only to most efficiently install the mechanical
just ripped
adaptations,
open.
which is of course exactly what has happened. Unlike the rest of humanity, who largely retained the view that the human form should not be abused, corrupted, nor deformed either naturally or artificially, with the obvious exception of basic augmetics, these are tolerated as being both either necessary or tolerable, and depending on where you have an augment carried out, could be quite visually high-end. The overall outlook on adaptation of the human form was only further entrenched once the religion of the Imperium took hold, and abuse of the human vessel was seen as only being evidence of a slide toward darkness, as those who drift towards those things which lie in the warp often see it as necessary to abuse their bodies with scarification and other more grotesque body modifications. The Mechanicus take a different view of this perspective. Even lowly adepts will usually have some small level of mechanical augmentation, while full tech priests and their senior magos will have a significant amount of augmentation. So much so that they may only be barely recognizable as human. Alongside the augmentations to their bodies, members of the Mechanicus may have their brains surgically altered to incorporate memo chips, engrams, or electrografts, allowing them to store and access a vast amount of information. They're often fitted with a variety of neural systems and plugs, which will then allow them to physically connect to a localized network of a planet or any terminal or machine. Tech priests also have access to the noosphere. This is effectively a wireless information system enabling the Mechanicus to connect and share information either at a local or wider level.
Damn. Imagine installing Google straight into your brain. To be completely honest though, with how forgetful all of us here on the channel are, and how little knowledge we all possess collectively, we might want to get these augmentations. But Luetin did bring up a point here that I found to be interesting. I didn't think of this, but a lot of the Chaos Legions, a lot of them don't even look human anymore, or they might just simply be possessing armor, Space Marine armor. And so, like, as a member of the Imperium of Man, once you see that those who fall into Chaos kind of take that form, or maybe like disrespect the human form to begin with, then yeah, it would make sense that the human form itself becomes like a part of your religious beliefs, which just makes what the Mechanicus do just blasphemous, right? But because of the power they possess, we can't really have any inquisitions anytime soon. Or rather, it's more like, if we did, humanity would just be doomed.
Specifics of this system are not especially well known, but it appears certainly to have originated from the Dark Age of technology. The essential and foundational system then for the Mechanicum and later Mechanicus was discovered by an explorator prior to the Great Crusade, along with secrets of energy transference, atomic restructuring, chemical engineering, and most importantly, the evolution of human cognition and digital communication through the noosphere. When using this, tech priests can absorb and share information and communication in some form of collective consciousness. It's often an unspoken but vitally important aspect of the Mechanicus, and one that makes their considerable augmentation a necessity, and it can enable them to remotely control different departments, doors, information about enemy movements and friendly, and give them a huge overview of what is occurring, say, in their area of a forge world in an emergency situation.
Dude, as a strategy gamer, this would be incredible to have. I'm not a psychologist and I'm not very knowledgeable in the field, but I feel like I've heard this term thrown around before. Was it Carl Jung who's talked about the collective subconscious or whatever? We played plenty of games here on the channel that had similar concepts. For those of you who are familiar with Uchikoshi's works, he mentions that a lot, and you know, the morphogenetic fields from 999 and whatnot. However, here it's not like it's some sort of a theory of like, oh, this is the face of a man who so many people throughout the world have seen this face of this man in their dreams. But it's more like they made this intentionally and are able to access it whenever necessary.
Beyond that, it's just a very efficient information sharing system with their fellow tech priests. When it comes to their form though, not all tech priests take the same view, and a lack of care is not the same thing as heretical abuse. Magos biologists of the Mechanicus are devoted to the belief that the form of humans is, in itself, to be revered. Their own creed states that the gene structure of humanity is as the Emperor, the Omnisire, intended, and therefore any unnecessary alterations to the human gene code is highly offensive. For most ordinary citizens, the sight of most members of the Mechanicus would be quite horrifying. And for this reason, among others, it's quite normal for senior members of the Mechanicus to not be seen by ordinary humans, which is certainly all the better when it comes to tech priests who have reached the point of being centuries old. By then, their physical organs are barely being kept alive by horrifically produced rejuvenate elixirs, and at that time the only thing which can really nourish the remaining mortal flesh left on their bodies. The sight though of such a monstrosity is something most humans would wish to avoid, and thankfully something that can be easily accommodated, within the very reasonable and not entirely untrue explanation that those senior members of any organisation would have no reason nor wish to engage with lowly ordinary members of humanity. They will have ordinary tech adepts do this for them, and so most of humanity see the Mechanicus as very similar to themselves, especially on the day-to-day level, where perhaps the most extreme members of the Mechanicus that they may encounter would only have fairly superficial adaptations that are very little different from anybody else, give or take the quality of the augmetics and perhaps their specific purposes. At its simplest though, one of the most fundamental and important aspects of the Mechanicus is just to maintain technology, acquire new information where possible, and most of all safeguard not just technology but all knowledge itself. And this is one of the core focal points for the Mechanicus, the preservation of knowledge. And it was this driving force that was the reasoning behind its origins. Thus, in the contemporary period, the Mechanicus continues to value the preservation of knowledge and the technology it enables as sacred and essential to the
Humanity was super advanced before the dark age of technology happened. There was like a bunch of AI and just super high tech that we used in order to like navigate the warp and whatnot, to discover like space travel. But then that happened and all of that knowledge was lost. So it makes a lot of sense why the Mechanicus would be very concerned with making sure all of this knowledge continue to exist, because if it is forgotten at any point, then the Imperium of Man as a whole would kind of collapse, since what we've got going for us is our technology to help a fight against the alien species out there. Like I forget what the weapon was called that the Royal Guardsmen used. I think it's like a las gun or something. Like if you didn't have at least that, then you wouldn't have a fighting chance against any of the alien species. But not that it's going to save your life or anything like that. But looking back through history, a lot of knowledge was passed down through like folk tales or like prayers, religious scripts and whatnot, creating this belief system and kind of cleverly hiding the just manual instructions of how to fix something through religious texts as some sort of prayer that you should do before you try to attempt to fix any machine is pretty ingenious.
Existence of humanity. This is of course an extreme oversimplification of what the Mechanicus believe, for their religion of the machine god governs everything they do, and it is a vastly complex structure of rites and ceremony that remains significantly unknown, hidden, and conceptually intangible for the rest of humanity, with exception of course to liberal usage of incense and simply praising, pleading and begging with a machine to function normally, something that is very relatable and long-standing tradition for all humanity, although perhaps without the incense. So while the Mechanicus is well known for its ability to forge and preserve technology for humanity, from everything as lowly as a servitor with basic augmetics through to immense god machines of the Titanicus and the gargantuan Gothic starships of the Imperial Navy, the Mechanicus remain devoted to, above all else, the preservation of knowledge, and it is for this reason that they very often augment themselves so heavily. Some have even gone so far as to merge themselves with others to ensure the continued preservation of the knowledge they themselves contain and comprehend. And this might be where someone could incorrectly use that classic quotation and battle cry of the Iron Hand Space Marines, "The flesh is weak," which I always enjoy reminding people as being both wrongly attributed to Ferrus Manus and furthermore taken far too literally. To just very briefly explain that, and I realise this is a little bit of an early tangent, but it is somewhat relevant. The Iron Hands Astartes believe that the death of their Primarch Ferrus Manus died due to his emotions clouding him, and unlike others such as Angron, who used his emotional fury as almost a defining trait, for Manus it caused his demise. The Iron Hands see the cold, emotionless function of technological adaptation as therefore being stronger than frail human emotion. There is of course undoubtedly also something in that about the literal weakness of human form compared to the mechanical, but this is really a secondary consideration. Then lastly, the quotation itself of "the flesh is weak" comes from not the Iron Hands Primarch, but from Vulcan of the Salamanders, who was replying to Manus. The full quotation being, "The flesh is weak, but deeds endure." Vulcan was trying to make the point that although individuals may die in the fight to preserve humanity, the legacy of what they have accomplished will endure throughout human history.
Yo, respect gained. The Salamanders are the legion who, like, the ones who care the most about citizens, right? But yeah, that's a cold line to say to someone. On its own, it really does sound like that, like, oh yeah, just looking down on the human flesh, but with more context, it completely changes the perspective that I used to have on the flesh is weak line.
Which I have always thought is an interestingly applicable message for the Mechanicus as well. Maybe somewhat of an obscure tangent, but it is in fact quite relevant to the philosophical outlook of the Mechanicus. It's simply that they may take it more literally, but both perspectives stand for either the Iron Hands motto or equally to the Mechanicus, because while the Mechanicus may also say that the flesh is weak, for them this is certainly at a more practical and primary reasoning, because they see biological forms as extremely fragile, easily damaged. Thus, they seek to prevent this and ensure the knowledge of an individual and their experience can be preserved, as they see this as the most important thing above all others. To this end, they can understand that their machine god has provided them with both the knowledge and technological capability to prevent its loss, and this is one of the reasons why the Mechanicus are over time seen to heavily augment themselves.
I'm so glad I watched this video. Now, this really makes me want to dive into just the other factions as well. Yeah, we got a brief overview of each faction, and I had my own preconceptions of them based off of that overview. Not to bring down Bricky's video or anything, like it's a great introduction because of the limited amount of time and just how many things that you have to cover, right? All of their beliefs are just so much more nuanced, and I gain a greater appreciation of them because of this video. And like, this is just the Adeptus Mechanicus. I wonder what information I'm still missing out on in regards to any of the other factions or even the alien species.
It carries the additional ritualistic benefit of bringing them closer to the machine god, as they steadily augment themselves, becoming more machine than biological. It's why those most senior members of the Mechanicus can accurately be described as barely being human at all. For those among the cult Mechanicus, their physical form embodies all their philosophical and religious understandings. To become less human, more machine, is highly symbolic for them, and it represents their ascension in becoming a more perfect form, not just practically or literally, but also metaphysically.
Mars and the cult. The beginning?
In the contemporary Imperium of M41, the Mechanicus homeworld of Mars stands as the ultimate forge world for the Adeptus Mechanicus. Its immense factory hives exist now to produce the bulk of equipment used in the Imperium. The vast orbital ring that surrounds the equatorial line of Mars is used as an orbital manufactorum that spins around the planet. Fleet starships and all manner of space construction emerge from these huge floating docks, while other vessels from all over the Imperium visit what is thought to be one of, if not the largest, man-made objects in the entire galaxy. On the surface below, and now obscured by millennia's worth of construction, the lower levels of the sprawling factory cities of Mars are supposedly the sites of where the first hive cities originated. Some of these are complete ruins, while others have been repurposed by consistent generations of development, while lower levels and disused districts become ghost towns with skeleton structures. Mars exists as a curious contrast of new towers of plasteel and even crystalline advanced materials punctuated with abandoned, heavily decayed industrial areas shrouded in perpetual fog, where the wastelands cover vast parts of the sprawling cities that are as large as entire continents. As I covered in the Rise and Fall of the Mechanicum video years ago, the origins of the tech priests have been passed on to new generations through their data stacks and illuminated holo scrolls, but rock-solid evidence of just what occurred during the fall and subsequent rise is fragmentary and conflicting. Their most ancient records suggest a long-forgotten age of technological marvels that could barely be imagined, let alone equaled in later millennia.
Before we continue, this just came into my head. I was looking at the architecture and then like the description of said architecture, and it made me think of one of my favorite mangas of all time. It's called Blom, or I think that's how you pronounce it. If you guys are fans of the grim and dark fantasy of Warhammer 40k, I highly recommend checking out that manga. It's an experience, and it's very different from a lot of other manga that you might read. So yeah, highly recommend it, and go check it out if you have some time.
Time is of course referred to by the Imperium and the Mechanicus Archaeo historians as the Dark Age of technology. These same records indicate that Mars was supposedly the first planet to be terraformed in this age, and to do so of course would have been an immense feat of technology, only possible during the height of humanity's achievements, and saw the famously red planet acquire a breathable atmosphere, its sterile desert landscape made fertile by the titanic technological prowess of humanity's zenith age of technology. As the tech priests tell it from their own records though, agriculture was never something significant to early Mars, for its true wealth lay beneath the surface in the form of gems, dense mineral deposits, and ore. And this was one of the reasons why it became such a technology and fabrication hub for humanity in its era of galactic colonization. Later studies upon the oldest structures on Mars demonstrated that cities spread rapidly across the planet, transforming it into the first human hive world. All those great achievements would collapse almost overnight in the scale of the greater timeline of human history though, because when the Age of Strife descended upon a human galactic civilization already struggling to salvage what it could from nearly destroying itself in one of its most devastating wars, humanity went beyond a brink it could never recover from, and nearly all that had been gained was lost, leaving Mars and all other human colonies blanketed by an age of darkness that human civilization would not emerge from until some 5,000 years later. Just as everywhere, Mars fell into a state of complete collapse racked by warp horrors and storms that rendered interstellar travel almost impossible. This meant extreme isolation, which in turn caused a complete collapse in communication and interstellar trade networks. Being some of the oldest and most developed worlds, both Earth and Mars were able to handle this disaster somewhat reasonably at first, but in fairly short order it said that they even turned upon each other in a desperate battle for resources that they had both long ago seen as being no longer necessary as a priority.
I do vaguely remember this being mentioned in the timeline video, but there was a time when it kind of became impossible to travel through the warp, right? And because of that, so many different planets became isolated and thus had to fend for themselves, and it wasn't till several thousand years later, 5,000 years here, I think is what he said, that we were able to like reconnect everything back together again. But yeah, I don't remember this specific part very well.
Such was their faith in human dominance over basic needs, where technology and the stability of their galactic trade systems seemed indomitable. And I think in that context, it's always important to remember that humanity during the Golden Age was so far advanced that individual worlds were incomparable to anything we would understand, and as such many key resources were entirely imported, and that might seem reckless and foolish to ourselves, but humanity of the Golden Age was, by all measures, vastly advanced, to the point where the very idea of basic requirements for survival, such as food and water, had apparently been barely a thought worthy of consideration, because they held an almost unbreakable confidence in themselves and their mastery of technology. And for good reason. At this time, humanity was, by all accounts, the most powerful civilization in the entire galaxy. It simply did not anticipate being hit with two massive disasters that were so extreme they brought humanity to the very brink of total extinction. As I have talked about before, when a collapse comes, it can happen fast, and the depths of a fall can be significant, especially in a highly compartmentalized technology-based civilization. This was the case for much of humanity in this time, and it meant that in the aftermath all that were left were a few highly capable people who would somehow pass something of their knowledge on through generations, but the rest of humankind devolved into what is often called techno-barbarism, effectively some bizarre death race apocalypse cyberpunk era, which sounds awesome. I think we'd all like to hear a lot more about that humanity from this time period. But of course, such destruction means that any records from the dark age of technology are meant to be extremely sparse, and historical records from the apocalyptic age of strife almost unheard of. What we do know only comes from the very tail end of this period, seen around Terra itself, as the Emperor and his followers and forces began to emerge. During the collapse of Mars, just like many thousands of other worlds, factions formed quickly, realizing the need to now urgently compete for resources and scavenge materials. Incidentally, there's nothing specific to suggest this, but I feel that in this time there's nothing which specifically points to all humans on Mars needing to be experts in technology. Yes, the planet was focused on technological production as we understand it, but Mars in this terraformed state, combined with the very different nature of humanity at this time, allows us to at least speculate that the population could have been quite diverse in its social stratification. So could the reasons as to why people were living there. Not to mention that in the highly advanced age of technology, it's often believed that humans by and large had risen above the need to actually understand and be capable of producing or maintaining some of their most advanced technology. Likely this was left to the STC, AI, or other products of genetic engineering. Again, highly speculative though, as we have almost no information about this period, but I believe this is very reasonably plausible. This is only important in how it paints a picture for us during the collapse, because although after this time Mars would emerge as a world with a populace wholly dedicated to not just technology and the archival storing of human knowledge, but an actual worship of machines and technology. I've often felt that sometimes people assume this was already largely the case on Mars prior to its catastrophic apocalypse, and my feeling is that that's just not the case, but who can say for sure? The reason why I feel this though is because from the way the tech priests would tell it, society imploded, and this led to the typically barbaric warlord domination over geographic territories. But more importantly, technology and how to maintain or operate it was seemingly very quickly lost. And that to me points to the fact that only a smaller number of individuals of the entire population actually understood such things, which aligns with what we know of humanity in its golden age, or indeed any highly advanced society, even our own right now to a degree, whereby you have highly compartmentalized specialists in a role, and without them things go very bad very quickly. It would be like if we suddenly had a massive global apocalypse ourselves, and sorry, I know last time I said that it actually happened, but imagine if 90% of the world's scientists and engineers suddenly disappeared. The pool of people able to maintain highly complex critical infrastructure would be severely diminished, to a point it would cause widespread malfunctions and destructive events, not to mention limiting their benefits to whatever populace remained, because quite simply all the people who would be there to support those systems ordinarily would just be gone. In the specific case of Mars, it had additional concerns because their atmospheric radiation shielding was lost in the spiraling devastation, causing the planet to be scoured by severe solar radiation, which additionally killed or heavily damaged the DNA of large swaths of the population, as well as obliterating the remaining fertile ground and flora. The survivors who had until then been fighting an above-ground battle for territory and resources were forced underground into the forges to escape the damaging effects of the radiation, which led to a cult-like importance being placed upon the expert technicians of Mars. Now, however this played out in actuality, the way it's told from the perspective of the Mechanicus is one of selfless devotion to maintaining essential systems and rising above the anarchy that had consumed the world.
Based off of the comments, I see that a lot of you guys have been talking about how some of the lore is kind of like told from certain perspectives, and so there's this aspect of unreliable narrators kind of telling their side of the story, right? So I guess it's like, who's to say what actually happened, but we just know how the state of things currently is.
Science quickly shifted to becoming so important that it was a central devoted cause to their very existence. And in time, this community of survivors emerged as the most powerful on Mars, science becoming worshipped in their cult-like group, and eventually the so-called cult of the machine god would emerge. Its leadership and highest-ranking members were all expert techs who had enabled the survival of their followers. These surviving Dark Age techs would become known as tech priests, which over time only further refined and expanded their cult religion that worships technology and their machine god, which they see as the supreme source of all knowledge. It's possible that due to the severe damage of the solar radiation, this was what initially caused them to begin replacing their body parts with mechanical artificial alternatives, and it was this practical necessity that was then later expanded upon philosophically and symbolically to be developed into the religious belief of the cult that the worth of a single man is only the sum of his knowledge, meaning his body is simply an organic vessel, a machine capable of preserving intellect, but for a limited period. Given the situation faced by the humans who were trying to cling on to their very survival, the origins of the cult of the machine seem obvious. There is also the issue of potential proximity to the entity known as the Void Dragon, who lies deep beneath the surface of Mars.
Here we go. I only learned this from the comments. Apparently there's like a shard of the Void Dragon, whatever that is, that's stuck below Mars. I don't really know what effect that would have on the people, but I guess we're about to learn here.
How involved this being was on the initial rise of the cult is unknown, but it at least appears to have had some influence on the cult and its origins. This was an extremely difficult period of survival for any who had managed not to be horribly scoured by the solar assault upon the surface, let alone the later struggle for resources below the surface, where rampaging groups of mutants, gangs, marauders who would assault those who were attempting to build something more civilized continuously. For the worshippers of the machine god, this was not expected, and its tech priests would make high-risk expeditions to the destroyed ruins of hive spores, attempting to then recover valuable technology whilst it was still serviceable. They restored oxygen recyclers and moisture traps, food processors, and all the things including weaponry they needed to survive. Their success though, of course, only brought many more to their doors seeking refuge, but the cult only had limited capacity, spread across its various enclaves, and this meant that only true worshippers of the machine god would be accepted. This undoubtedly led to a highly concentrated group of followers who were both motivated and defensive of the cult of the machine, which obviously had the consequence of only increasing the strength of belief and worship within the cult's followers. Eventually, as the most powerful and likely only surviving of these underground groups, the followers of the cult of the machine would become the dominant rulers in this time, and they would become known hereafter as the Cult Mechanicus of Mars. The tech priests of this religion devoted themselves to the divine trinity of the machine god, the omniscire, and the motive force, which is, according to their dogma, the source of all power and life in the galaxy. They would rise once again to build the first of their temples, including what would become the Temple of All Knowledge. Housed within this temple's plasteel shell, shining pistons hold the mile-high vaulted ceiling, which can be raised and lowered to alter its acoustic properties and thereby able to accentuate the hymns and praise sung to the machine god. The high altar within takes the form of a vast database containing the cumulative knowledge of the tech priests. And even in M41, every new discovery is committed to this high altar. Every temple on Mars and throughout the Forge Worlds is connected to the altar by means of a living transmat link, a psychic servitor whose mind co-joins all altars of the Cult Mechanicus into one holy machine entity. When the tech priests began construction of these temples, they also began to lay the foundations for what they envisaged as being the essential military arm of their cult. This would take the form of standard military units, infantry, armor, and so on. But the tech priests also constructed immense war machines capable of functioning in the defense or assault of entire planets, the Titan Legions. Now, just as with all information about this time, the exact origin of the Titans is shrouded in the opaque mists of apocalyptic history.
Only reason I know about the Titans is because I first saw them in Warhammer Space Marine, and from what chat was telling me is that there are like the knights who used to be like the farming equipment, but then they were kind of like structured into war machines after the crisis, and then there's the Titans, which are just like the big guys who are here to like decimate everything. It'll be interesting to know more about them because they are so incredibly valuable apparently that you would risk sending down Space Marines onto an orc infested planet just to make sure that you can get it back, or at the very least that none of the orcs can even get their hands on it.
Some maintain that the tech priests themselves fashioned the Titans out of the remnants of destroyed technology from the Dark Age, others that they had STC patterns to work with. The truth of it all is difficult to say, and it likely falls somewhere in between. Titans appear to have existed from before the Age of Strife, and so it's possible they were at one time one of the immense weapons used during the Dark Age of technology. We know humans of this time had the ability to integrate and connect themselves directly with its AI in something of a linked consciousness. We have seen evidence for shared integration in the conversations some members of the Mechanicus have stumbled upon as well, and all of this aligns with the constructions we know of Knights and Titans through their throne mechanisms, which enables the Princeps to pilot Titans and the Knight pilots and so on. So it all points to technology of the Dark Age, and that the Mechanicus likely restored and repurposed this, likely not with the level of efficiency or power as was seen in the Golden Age for humanity. But for the tech priests, Titans were now more than simply a very powerful machine. They were an aspect of the machine god itself, a holy creation of technology, and to be part of a crew aboard a Titan is to serve the machine god. For a tech priest, it is one of the greatest roles they can perform. But it would still be many centuries, if not millennia, before any other humans outside of Mars itself would hear that title, as they first needed to restore themselves to a strength capable of reclaiming surface facilities. And then reaching out and repairing the orbital shipyards, this was no simple task either. Still, more centuries would pass before even the first of any of those ships could depart on their grand quest. In this time, they had long studied Old Earth and were appalled by the destruction unleashed there. The planet itself had been almost completely destroyed, and instead the cult Mechanicus decided they should focus upon the wider galaxy, estimating there would be worlds out there which should have retained more technology from the Dark Age. The tech priests had studied the warp phenomena for the longest time, attempting to understand their energy patterns, and at least in a fairly rudimentary way, they were able to predict when the storms were going to be weaker or stronger, and thus they speculated sending out expeditions when the warp storms were at their weakest should be feasible. Steadily, the cult Mechanicus would attempt its quest for knowledge, which also doubled in reconnecting with humanity. They sent out many Ark fleets, most of which contained full Titan legions, whilst still in the period known as the Age of Strife. Many would be lost in the extreme turbulence of the warp, but others successfully established colonies that would become new Forge Worlds, protected by their immense Titan legions, which would become essential not just for the immediate time, but later for the survival of humanity.
When you see an image of the battleships, you don't really understand the scale of them, but since I was able to see how big a Titanus actually is in a game compared to a huge space marine dude, and they contain legions of Titanus inside of those giant battleships, boy. Those things are massive.
Into the future. No matter the worlds they found themselves upon, the tech priests of Mars knew their mission was clear: to secure in the name of their faith all knowledge, and that this quest could be justified by any means or cost. What the tech priests discovered as they ventured into the galaxy was disturbing. The Eldar that humanity had once known as a refined and respectable people had devolved into extremely disturbing behaviours and were now immensely hostile. Similarly, other aliens such as the Orcs were now running unchecked and assaulting any world or ships they encountered. Worse still, they found that many human worlds had fared little better than Earth itself and had collapsed completely in terms of technology. In their place were often states of governance that resembled feudal systems. While some of these were barbaric and ignorant, reveling in the very worst vices and traits of human history, others were overseen by aristocratic nobles who not only welcomed the tech priests, but also who shared heritage with their powerful knight suits, which resembled small-scale titans in many ways. The tech priests would often found new forge worlds on planets that were mineral-rich, where they could easily build industry and forges. Often, these would have proximity to a knight world so that they could both share in the stability, trade and production support that they could offer one another. And this mutual dependency was greatly beneficial for all concerned, given the instability of the galaxy at that time. Over millennia, both Knight and Forge worlds became more powerful, and often you would see a Forge world with multiple Knight worlds in a system being supported by it. They shared not only technology, but a steady increase in the sophistication of their societies. Forge worlds were also to remain in contact with one another, and even periodically message would be received on Mars of the progress being made out in the wider galaxy by Forge worlds. All of the data being downloaded into their grand altars of knowledge. So it's another scenario where I would venture the question, was the Emperor and his grand plan ultimately necessary? Because the tech priests were actually doing quite well and had easily the capability to continue their expansion. connecting with other worlds that had survived the Age of Strife, but without the discriminating extermination and subjugation that came later with the Emperor's Great Crusade. Speaking of which...
The Omnissiah. I don't know enough about the subject to have an opinion on it.
One of the final and most important developments for the emergence of the Cult of the Machine, the Cult Mechanicus, and Mars was of course the arrival of the Omnissiah. On Terra it was the time of unification, and out of the ruined apocalypse, a figure had emerged known only as the Emperor. This individual seemed to have achieved the impossible, uniting the warring tribes of the ancient homeworld. Mars had always kept a close eye on Terra, not least because it had been easy pickings for scavenging Dark Age technology for centuries, but the leadership of Mars had received unusually communication that this figure of the Emperor wanted to make contact, even visit with them. Intense debate followed about who this being was and how they should receive him on Mars. For many within the cult, the ability and knowledge of the Emperor that he had demonstrated in achieving the conquest of Earth was surely proof that he was a representative of the machine god. Still, others contended that he was in fact the divine intellect that they had prophesied as the Omnissiah. But the cult was divided. Some members would not accept a vague declaration of this Emperor as the Omnissiah, and the divisions became heated, even going so far as to see a small coup attempt by senior tech priests, but which gained little support and was quickly put down.
Makes
Why
sense.
did the Cult Mechanicus view the Emperor as a deity figure at all though? And why not just another successful warlord of old Earth? Well, it comes down to his ability to display understanding and manipulation of technology. Because for the tech priest's knowledge is the supreme manifestation of divinity. All creatures and artifacts that embody knowledge are holy. For them, the Emperor himself was clearly the supreme object of this worship, and so they viewed him as being the Omnissiah because of his seemingly limitless knowledge of technology and ability to apparently fix things just by a touch. Such references point perhaps again to what we know from the advanced systems of the Golden Age, that they may well have had systems that operated to some degree with biointegration far beyond our comprehension. But whatever the Emperor actually is, he certainly exists as a technological genius who passed through the Golden Age and could have had access or experience to this advanced technology.
So, while we don't really know how the Emperor came about, or like where he came from, apparently there was this new book that came out that you guys were talking about, that it kind of points to the Emperor being like someone who was essentially the collective consciousness or whatever of a bunch of psychers who game ended themselves in order to create this being who had these ultimate psyker abilities to kind of guide humanity in its darkest age. That was like way back when, before any of this happened. And so he's practically like immortal, right? And maybe he was able to remember how all this technology works simply because he was there and he was working on them and he used them, right? But yeah, obviously to the tech priest on Mars, it would seem like he's a literal god who can just touch anything and make it work.
The fires of combat were still burning in the manufactories when the Fabricator General and the Emperor signed the Treaty of Mars to formally ally their two empires and guarantee sovereignty to each. Under the terms of the treaty,
Nice.
the Mechanicum now undertook to supply weapons, ships and war machines necessary for the Great Crusade and for the defense of the burgeoning Imperium. In exchange, they demanded that the Emperor's forces turn over to them all of the technologies they had so far discovered. As we enter into the final days of critical development in Martian history, the designation of Mechanicum or Mechanicus is one that I always feel I have to note, as it so often is misunderstood and misused, but it is really very simple. Until the dark period of the Horus Heresy, the tech priests of Mars were known as the Mechanicum, but their religion itself that had originated before this time is the Cult Mechanicus. During the heresy, the Mechanicum was riven by the division of loyalties with its leader siding with Horus, and many Forge Worlds did not align with the traitors who believed a new age of freedom would lie with the War Master's vision for humanity. And so there was often an exodus of Mechanicum tech priests to Terra itself, and they would eventually assign themselves a new leader in this time and develop a new designation of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It was an extremely painful time for the refugees of Mars, for they had to watch as vast resources were pitted against the traitors and the defense of Terra but not in the liberation of Mars itself. Eventually, of course, the planet would be retaken and the traitors driven off into the Eye of Terror. Many members of the Mechanicum survived there and would become what is known as the Dark Mechanicum. But significant damage had been caused, and incalculable quantities of human knowledge were lost once again in this time. This, though, is the simple difference between the naming conventions of Mechanicum and Mechanicus. One is before the split during the heresy, and the other is post-heresy when it would become the Adeptus Mechanicus. It's really as simple as that.
Zero, what are you doing? The video's not even over yet! Look, okay? I'm sorry. Full disclosure here, I did watch a few minutes past this point, but my brain was, finagle-dazzling. And I know that's not a word, but that's exactly what it was doing. I felt like I wasn't giving any interesting commentary and being engaging enough, so I decided to stop there. There's nothing that I hate more than a reactor who's not doing their job, so I try my best to not be that person. I also want to thank everyone for being so positive and helpful in the comments. If you guys want to see me react to the rest of the video, then offer your lives to the machine god known as the YouTube algorithm. If you haven't seen them already, check out my other Warhammer 40k reactions in the playlist that has conveniently appeared on your screen. And if it hasn't, just pretend that it's there.